The stamp was wrong. That was the first thing Velsharath noticed, not the silence in the chamber, not the empty seat where Earth's delegate had sat for 11 years, not even the way the human ambassador had folded his identification card before placing it on the table. It was the stamp on the expulsion document. The ink had been pressed too hard. The paper had buckled slightly beneath it, a small ridge of compressed fiber running along the bottom edge of the seal. In 32 years of serving as archive keeper for the Galactic Deliberative Council, Velsharath had processed 4,912 expulsion orders. He had never seen one stamped that hard before. He told himself it was nothing. He filed the document. He sealed the archive drawer. He walked home through the silver corridors of Threshold Station and did not think about the buckled paper again for almost 3 years. He should have thought about it every single day. The expulsion itself had taken 11 minutes. Councillor Dreshamala of the Valorian Compact had brought the motion. 14 other species had seconded it. The humans had been given, by council charter, exactly 48 hours to present a defense. Their senior delegate, a woman named Commander Yara Akafar, had stood at the podium with her hands flat on the railing, fingers pressed white against the metal, and said exactly 9 words. "You are making a mistake you cannot afford to make." Not a plea, not an argument, not a counter-motion or a legal challenge or an appeal to the historical record of Earth's contributions to the Council over the previous decade. Just 9 words, delivered in a tone that Velsharath's translation membrane had briefly struggled to categorize, filing it under warning before correcting to statement of fact. Dreshamala had not been concerned. "The motion carries," he said. "Earth's provisional membership is hereby suspended pending a full review of the Karath incident. Human vessels will vacate council space within 60 standard rotations." Akafar had nodded once. She had picked up her identification card, folded it in half, another thing Velsharath had never seen a delegate do, and placed it on the table. She had not looked back as she left the chamber. The council had exhaled. Several delegates had exchanged what Velsharath understood to be relieved expressions. The Valorian bloc in particular seemed to settle into their seats with the particular physical looseness that indicated tension successfully discharged. He had processed the expulsion order. He had noticed the stamp. And 3 days later, as Earth's final cargo hauler departed council transit space, and the last ping of a human transponder faded from the station's tracking grid, Velsharath had sat in his archive room and felt something he could not name. Something his species' emotional lexicon had 17 words for discomfort, and none for the specific sensation of watching a door close and immediately wondering if you had just locked yourself inside. He filed that feeling with the document. He did not look at either one again. For a while. The Karath incident, for those who had not lived through it, required context that the Council preferred not to distribute broadly. The official summary described it as a navigational and diplomatic boundary violation in which 3 human scout vessels had entered the Karath exclusion zone without authorization and subsequently destroyed a Valorian observation platform. What the official summary did not describe was what the humans had found inside the Karath exclusion zone, or what they had done with that information before the Council stripped their communications array, or why, in the 61 days between the destruction of the platform and the formal expulsion vote, every senior human diplomat on Threshold Station had begun sleeping, by unanimous and unannounced consensus, in shifts. These were the 3 things Velsharath thought about in the years that followed when he could not sleep. The first, what had the humans found? The second, why had they said nothing about it at the expulsion hearing? Nothing, not even to save themselves. The third, what does it mean when the only species in the Council's recorded history to be expelled without filing a single counter-argument is also the only species that had ever, in their brief 11-year membership, contributed more to Council defense infrastructure than they had consumed? He did not have answers. He filed the questions under a private archive tag he labeled, with characteristic archival precision, pending. They stayed pending for 2 years, 4 months, and 17 days. Then the fleet arrived. It did not arrive the way fleets arrived in Council threat assessments, not as a vanguard line crossing a sensor boundary, not as a coordinated jump emergence that lit every proximity alarm from here to the outer bands. It arrived the way weather arrives, gradually and then completely. The first contact was a single vessel, long, dark, running no transponder signal that matched any registry in Council space. It dropped out of transit at the edge of Threshold Station's outer patrol zone and simply waited, broadcasting on a frequency that Council communication systems hadn't actively monitored since the early days of the expansion, because nothing used that frequency anymore. Nothing except, apparently, this. Commander Veth Parath of the Council Response Frigate Steadfast pulled up the signal analysis on his secondary screen and stared at it for a moment before speaking. Communications. What is that? Unknown registry, Commander. The vessel class doesn't match any Council catalog. Approximately 4 times the displacement of a standard Valorian heavy cruiser. Hull material is giving us interference on deep scan. We can't get a clean internal read. Interference or deflection. A pause. Deflection, Commander. Veth Parath had served 20 years in Council patrol operations. He had encountered unregistered vessels before. Smugglers, fringe species prospectors, the occasional Drift Clan ship running without papers for cultural reasons. He had a practiced specific language for each category of vessel, calibrated to achieve compliance without escalation. What he said, looking at the readings, was not from any of those categories. Send a general hail, he said. Standard Council challenge. The signal came back 17 seconds later. 17 seconds. Which was, given the distance, physically impossible for a normal communication relay, which meant the vessel had responded before the hail arrived because it had already known the hail was coming. The response was in Valorian standard, precise, unaccented. This is UNES Akafar's promise. We are not requesting docking clearance. We are not requesting communication with the Council. We are requesting that you send a message to Archive Keeper Vel Sharath. Tell him that the pending file is ready to close. Veth Parath looked at his crew. His crew looked at him. Who, he said very carefully, is Vel Sharath? Vel Sharath received the message 40 minutes later in the middle of his 4th cycle archival review, and he read it 3 times before he trusted what he was seeing. The Akafar's promise, named for a person. That was the first impossibility Council military convention named vessels for places, for concepts, for celestial events. Never for people. It was considered dangerous in most Council cultures to name a weapons platform for a person. It implied that the vessel had something to prove. He pulled up the public Council registry. No record of the Akafar's promise, no record of the vessel class, no record of the prefix designation UNES. He went to the archive. He pulled the 11-year file of Earth's Council membership. He searched for UNES. He found it in a footnote, buried in Earth's original membership application. The documents most Council clerks had skimmed past because humans had submitted them in 17 simultaneous languages, and the sheer volume had been treated as a bureaucratic eccentricity rather than a deliberate strategy. United Nations Earth Space Command. Theoretical Deep Exploration and Defense Program. Current status, pre-funding. 11 years ago. Before Earth had even formally joined the Council, before the Karath incident, before the expulsion. They had been planning this before they arrived. His hands were very still on the desk. The question he had been asking for 2 years, what did the humans find in the Karath exclusion zone, suddenly felt like the wrong question. Suddenly the question felt like, what did humans already know before they ever set foot in Council chambers? He sent a message back to Commander Veth Parath. Tell them I'm coming to the station. Then he went to the archive drawer he hadn't opened in 2 years, 4 months, and 17 days. He took out the expulsion document. He looked at the buckled paper. The stamp pressed too hard. Not carelessness, he realized now. Not bureaucratic fatigue. Emphasis. What he found at Threshold Station's outer dock was not one ship. Vel Sharath had taken the fastest transit available, which meant he arrived ahead of most of the Council notification cascade. He was among the first non-military personnel to see what was actually out there. He stood at the observation window of the Dock Authority building, and pressed his secondary hands flat against the glass and breathed very slowly and counted. He stopped counting at 43 because the formation extended beyond the window's line of sight. The ships were not identical. That was the second thing that caught him, the thing that had not appeared in any Council threat assessment protocol he'd ever reviewed. Every war fleet in Council history had been built around standardized hulls, manufacturing efficiency, shared logistics, coordinated tactical doctrine. You looked at a Valorian battle group, and every vessel was a variation on 3 or 4 blueprints. These ships were not variations. They were originals. Each one was distinct, as if built by different hands from different blueprints for different purposes, and yet they moved in formation with a precision that suggested they had trained together for years, maybe longer. The Akafar's promise was at the front. Even from here, Vel-Shareth could see that the hull was not factory smooth. It was covered in something, additions, modifications, welded sections that didn't match the original plating. It looked, he thought, like a living thing that had kept growing after it was finished. Archive Keeper Vel-Shareth, he turned. A human woman in a uniform he didn't recognize, not the formal council interface suit that Earth delegates had always worn, but something darker, more practical, with no council insignia anywhere on it, stood 3 meters away. She was perhaps 50 years old by human reckoning. Her hair was silver. Her face had the particular quality of stillness that Vel-Shareth had learned to associate over 11 years of working near humans, with people who had decided something and were no longer expending energy on reconsidering it. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Adisa," she said. "I'm to take you to the Admiral." "Admiral Akafar," he said, because it was the only name he had. Something crossed the woman's face. "Commander Akafar died 14 months ago. I'm taking you to Admiral Tors." He wanted to ask. He did not ask. He followed her. The inside of the Akafar's promise was its own revelation. He had expected military functionality, clean lines, operational efficiency, the aesthetic of a weapon. What he found, instead, was something closer to a city that had decided to become a warship. The corridors were wide enough for 3 humans abreast, but the walls were covered in things that had no military justification. Photographs. Physical printed photographs, thousands of them, pinned and taped and welded into frames along every corridor he walked through. Places, people, children, old buildings, coastlines. "What are these?" he asked Lieutenant Commander Adisa. "Reasons," she said, and did not elaborate. He wanted to ask what that meant. He was beginning to understand that wanting to ask and receiving an answer were not the same thing on this vessel. Admiral Tors met him in a room that was not a command center or a conference room, but something in between. A long table, star charts covering 1 full wall, and along the opposite wall, a series of sealed containers Vel-Shareth did not recognize. The Admiral was a compact man, dark-skinned, with the kind of physical economy of movement that suggested someone who had spent a long time in confined spaces and learned to be precise. He was standing when Vel-Shareth entered. He did not sit down. "You kept the file open," Tors said. Yes, I noticed some irregularities in the expulsion procedure. And the Karath material, you flagged it as incomplete." This was not a question. Vel-Shareth felt the distinct and unsettling sensation of realizing that he had been watched. "How did you know that?" "Because you were the only one who did." Tors turned to the star chart. Everyone else on Threshold Station accepted the official summary. "You were the only council employee who put a hold on the Karath file and marked it as requiring supplementary documentation. It was a procedural matter. The destruction of the observation platform required a formal incident report from the involved vessels, and no such." "We filed it," Tors said, 3 times. The Council's intake system returned it as corrupted each time." He paused. The corruption was not accidental. The room was very quiet. "What did your ships find in the Karath exclusion zone?" Vel-Shareth asked. Tors looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked to the sealed containers along the wall and placed his hand against the nearest one. "That's the wrong question," he said. "The right question is, why was the exclusion zone established? And who established it? And why did the Valorian Compact classify the founding documents of the exclusion zone 17 years before humans ever made contact with the Council?" Velshareth's primary and secondary hands both went still. "What?" he said. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that the Karath exclusion zone was not established to protect unknown territory," Tors said. "It was established to hide evidence that the Valorian Compact had been making contact with an exterior force for at least 30 years before the Council's current charter, a force that is not a member species. A force that the Compact has been negotiating with, in secret, in exchange for something the rest of the Council has never been told about. The star charts were very bright on the wall, and your ships found this evidence." "Our ships found the edge of it," Tors said. 3 scouts and a navigation buoy recording. The platform we destroyed was not an observation platform. It was a relay node in a communication network that doesn't appear on any Council infrastructure map." Velshareth looked at the sealed containers. "The evidence is in there. Some of it. And the rest," Tors smiled. It was a small, specific kind of smile, the kind that contained information rather than warmth. "The rest is why we have 47 ships and not 3 scouts." This was the moment, standing in that room, looking at that smile, that Velshareth began to understand what he should have understood 3 years ago, when he'd first held the expulsion document with its too hard stamp. The humans had not been expelled from the Council. Not really. They had been removed from a position where the Valorian Compact could monitor them, and the humans had known this was coming, which was why they had said nothing in their defense, because anything they said would have told the Compact exactly how much they knew and where they had gotten it. 9 words, and then silence, and then 60 rotations of apparently compliant withdrawal that had actually been 60 rotations of preparation. The fold in Akafar's identification card. Not a gesture of defeat, a mark. "I was here, I saw this, I will be back." "They allowed the expulsion," Velshareth said slowly. "Commander Akafar, she allowed it deliberately. The expulsion was the strategy." Tors said nothing, which was its own answer. "Because inside the Council your communications were monitored. Your movements were logged, but outside Council space you were ungoverned. You could build, you could travel, you could investigate without oversight." 2 years, 4 months, Tors said. "Roughly. You built all of this." Velshareth gestured toward the ship around him, the fleet beyond it, "in 2 years. "We didn't build all of it in 2 years, Tors said. "We built all of it that needed to be secret in 2 years. The rest had been in development since before Akafar ever walked into a Council chamber." The pre-funding footnote. The theoretical program. The name that no one had taken seriously because humans submitted everything in 17 languages, and the sheer volume was eccentricity. Not eccentricity. Coverage. Every Council clerk who had skimmed past those documents because humans were verbose and bureaucratically chaotic had been, in retrospect, looking directly at the answer to a question they would not think to ask for another decade. "What do you need from me?" Velshareth asked. "Access to the Council's closed archive," Tors said. "Specifically the founding documentation of the Karath exclusion zone, the Valorian Compact's original membership application, and the full unredacted record of every communication between Compact representatives and Council logistics over the last 40 years. Those files are sealed by senior Council authority. I know. You have provisional emergency access as archive keeper. Applicable when there is evidence of a threat to Council security." Velshareth stared at him. "You read the Council charter. We read everything we were given access to, and some things we weren't." Tors looked at him steadily. "The question, Keeper, is whether you believe there is evidence of a threat to Council security, because I can give you everything we have, and you can look at it, and you can decide." He put his hand on the sealed container again. "But I should tell you," he said, "that every person on this ship who has looked at that evidence has had the same reaction." "What reaction?" For the first time, something moved in Tor's face that was not calculation or precision or that contained smile. Something older. Something that had been sitting behind his eyes for 2 years, 4 months, and however many days. "They stopped sleeping in shifts," he said, "and started sleeping in turns, because someone needs to be awake every hour. Not for tactical reasons." He opened the container. "Because the evidence tells you something is coming. And once you know it, you cannot unknow it, and the idea of being unconscious for 6 hours at a stretch stops feeling like rest and starts feeling like a gamble." The contents of the container were simple: a data module, a series of printed transcripts, and a series of photographs, not the kind on the corridor walls, not places and children and coastlines. These were images from deep space. Very deep space. Beyond the outer bands, beyond any charted territory, in the region the Council had collectively, and without formal discussion, simply not looked at for 30 years. The images showed something in that space. Something that was not a star, not a nebula, not any natural formation Vel'Sharath's 11-year archive of Council astronomical records had ever catalogued. Something that was built. Something that was very, very large. Something that, according to the timestamp on the most recent image, was closer than it had been in the image taken 14 months before. Vel'Sharath looked at the photographs for a long time. "The Valorian Compact has been negotiating with whoever built that," he said. "Yes." "In exchange for what?" Tors picked up one of the transcripts. He held it out. The translation at the top read, "Compact Offer Session 12. Proposed Exchange. Navigational maps of Council Interior Space, Population Distribution, Infrastructure NODES Defense Response Times." Below that, the response from the other party, rendered in a language that Council translators had apparently never encountered before, because the translation had been done manually, with human handwriting in the margins, small and dense and annotated in 3 colors of ink. Below that, the human translation of the response. "Acceptable. Timeline accelerated upon receipt." "They sold us," Vel'Sharath said. His voice was very level. He was somewhat proud of that. "They sold everyone," Tors said. "Every species in the Council, every infrastructure node, every population center, every defensive installation. Delivered to something that has been moving toward this region of space for at least 30 years, probably longer. The Compact's first contact session, as far as we can reconstruct, happened 47 years ago." 47 years. Vel'Sharath looked up. "The exclusion zone was established 46 years ago." "Yes. And for 47 years no one in the Council was looking," Tors said. "The Karath exclusion zone is roughly in the direction of the construction. Any survey mission that might have looked in the right direction was redirected. Any long-range astronomical data that pointed toward it was quietly reclassified. The Compact has 17 seats on Council administrative committees. They have been very thorough." The photographs were still in Vel'Sharath's hands. The thing in the images, he could not stop his mind from trying to resolve it into something known. It kept failing. It was simply too large and too structured and too wrong for any category he had. "What is it?" he said. "We don't know," Tors said. "We know what it's for." "How?" "Because the transcripts include a technical briefing from the Compact to their contact. The briefing describes, in considerable detail, the Council's current capacity to resist large-scale exterior military pressure." He paused. "The briefing concludes that resistance capacity is minimal and that arrival should proceed on the accelerated timeline." "The accelerated timeline," Vel'Sharath said. "What does that mean in terms of current estimate based on observed transit speed, and the distance in the most recent image is between 14 and 18 months. The room was the quietest it had ever been. And your fleet," Vel'Sharath said, 47 ships. "That's what we've brought here," Tors said. "There are more, but we need the Council to open the archive before I can tell you how many more and where and what the full plan is. Because the plan requires Council cooperation at an institutional level, and I cannot brief an institution that still has Compact representatives in senior administrative positions." He looked at Vel'Sharath with that steady, ancient steadiness. "You have provisional emergency access. You can open a protected Council session with restricted attendance. The authority to convene one without Compact knowledge sits in a charter provision that has never been used because it has never been needed." "You read the whole charter," Vel'Sharath said again, slightly dazed. "We read the whole charter," Tors confirmed. 3 times. We found 6 provisions the original Council drafters included and then apparently forgot about. The emergency session authority is Provision 4. Provision 6 is somewhat more interesting, but we'll get to that." Vel'Sharath looked at the photographs one more time. He looked at the transcript. He looked at the handwritten annotations in the margins, the manual translation work, the 3 colors of ink, the thousands of hours of careful human labor compressed into the margins of a page that described his civilization being sold to something in the dark. "Commander Akaffer," he said. "Did she know all of this when she stood at the podium?" Tors was quiet for a moment. She knew the shape of it. "We didn't have the full transcript record until 14 months ago. That was the operation that," he stopped. His jaw moved once carefully. "That was the operation that cost us the commander. She died getting this. She died getting the last piece of it, the piece that confirmed the timeline." He looked at the container. "The ship is named for her." Vel Shareth thought about 9 words. "You are making a mistake you cannot afford to make. Not a warning to the council about the compact. Not a legal argument. A warning about the expulsion itself, about removing from council space the only species that was already looking in the right direction." "She knew," he said. "When she stood there, she knew what the compact had done, and she let them expel humanity anyway." "She understood," Tors said, "that if she presented the evidence in that chamber with 17 compact-aligned delegates present, the evidence would disappear and so would the witnesses, and Earth would be alone, ungoverned, and on the wrong side of council law with nothing to show for it. But if she said nothing, we were outside, ungoverned, free to build, free to investigate, free to come back when we had something that couldn't be made to disappear." He gestured at the 47 ships around them. "Something that can't be made to disappear," Vel Shareth said softly. 47 ships with full archive copies of everything, distributed so that destroying any one vessel only guarantees the evidence reaches more hands. Every crew member carries an encrypted copy. The key to decrypt it is held by non-human allies outside council space, 3 species who had no connection to the council and no reason to be interfered with. Tors paused. "We were not just building ships for 2 years. We were building a system that could not be silenced." This was the moment Vel Shareth finally understood the stamp. Not emphasis, not accident. The deliberate mark of someone pressing down hard enough to leave a permanent record in the paper itself, in the physical, irreducible material of the world, which cannot be recalled or corrupted or reclassified. The last act of a woman who understood that she was about to walk into a silence she had chosen and wanted one small, unambiguous piece of herself to remain where she had been. "I was here. I saw this. I will be back." "What do you need me to do?" Vel Shareth said. Tors began to tell him. The emergency council session happened 31 hours later, in a chamber so restricted that Vel Shareth had to physically disable 4 administrative relays to prevent its convening from appearing on the compact accessible scheduling system. 9 delegates attended. The compact's 17 were not among them. Tors presented the evidence in the order he had determined would be most effective. First, the exclusion zone founding documents which shattered the official history, then the communication transcripts which provided motive, then the astronomical photographs which provided urgency. He spoke for 3 hours without notes. His lieutenant commander Adisa handled the technical briefing, the trajectory calculations, the timeline estimates, the defense gap analysis. The 9 delegates were very quiet by the end. The quietness of people who have just learned that a door they thought led to safety had been locked from the outside. One of them, Councillor Ayerth of the Thurian Cooperative, a species whose political philosophy was founded on consensus, and whose physical appearance conveyed emotion through chromatic skin shifts, had turned a color that Vel Shareth had never seen on a Thurian before, and could not find in his reference files. "You're telling us," Ayerth said, "that this has been happening for 47 years. The first contact session, yes. The active collaboration, the provision of navigational data began approximately 19 years ago. And you," Ayerth looked at Tors, "found this. We found the edge of it when we were still council members. We found the rest of it after we were removed." The color on Ayerth's skin shifted again. "The expulsion the compact engineered the expulsion to prevent you from presenting this evidence. That is our conclusion, yes. And you said nothing. At the hearing, Commander Akaffer calculated that silence was the more survivable strategy. She, a human decided to accept expulsion, with full knowledge of what the compact had done, rather than reveal what she knew, because she had already planned a response that required operating outside the council's jurisdiction. Irth's voice had taken on a quality that the translation membrane filed as difficulty processing simultaneous emotional states. She accepted punishment for something that was done to her people in order to be free to build the thing that would address it. Yes, Tors said. That is, Irth started again. That is not a thing a rational political actor does. No, Tors said. It isn't. It requires the capacity to absorb a wrong and convert it into a resource. To suffer an injustice and use the momentum of it to, Irth stopped again. How long did she know before the hearing? She had known for 11 months. 11 months of sitting in council chambers, knowing, saying nothing, building the architecture of a response with the other hand. She's dead, Tors said quietly. In case you were wondering why I'm here instead, she got us most of the way there. We got the rest. He looked at the evidence spread across the table. She would want me to say that this isn't about what the compact did to Earth. It's about what comes in 14 months, and the question we need to answer is whether we can be ready for it. Irth looked at the photographs. Can we? Tors took a moment, not from uncertainty, Velshara thought, but from precision. From the same quality of care Akafor must have had, deciding which 9 words out of 1,000 were the right 9. We have 47 ships here, Tors said. We have more outside council space. What we are building is not a battle fleet in the traditional sense. It is a contact strategy, because, he paused, and the pause was the most deliberate thing Velsharath had ever watched a human do. The construction we've photographed is not a weapon in the military sense. The transcripts describe it as a threshold device, something that, when activated, establishes a permanent transit anchor at its current location. The chamber was completely still. If it activates, Tors said, it creates a fixed point through which an unlimited number of vessels can transit from wherever it came from into this region of space, instantly, indefinitely, without any need to navigate council space individually. He looked around the table. The compact's negotiation didn't purchase a battle, it purchased a door. And if we destroy the device before it activates, then the door doesn't open. And whatever is on the other side of it is limited to whatever already came through to build it. Tors let that sit in the room, which is considerably less unlimited. How considerably? We don't know. The photographs suggest the construction crew is not large. 6, maybe 8 vessels. Whatever built the threshold device was designed for construction, not combat. He paused again. Which means the window is now before the device activates. Before whatever army it's meant to let through is standing on our side of the door. Irth looked at the star charts, at the photographs, at the human admiral standing in the restricted chamber of a governing body that had expelled his species 2 years ago and that he had come back to, not with recrimination, not with demands, not even with the full weight of the justified anger he could have brought, but with a plan, with evidence. With the specific, unhurried methodology of people who had been thinking about the problem for longer than anyone in this room had realized was possible. What do you need from the council? Irth said. Tors reached into his jacket and removed a document. Provision 6 of the original charter, he said, grants the council the authority to temporarily reinstate any suspended member at wartime emergency status with full operational rights, in circumstances where the suspended member possesses unique tactical or intelligence value relevant to an active threat. He placed the document on the table. It has never been invoked. We need it invoked tonight. And if we do, Velsharath said, what changes? Earth is back in the council, Tors said, and UNES Command has operational authority under council wartime emergency protocols. And 47 ships becomes, he paused, and the contained smile was back, but something different was in it now, something that Velsharath had come to associate with humans who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and were finally setting it down, considerably more than 47. Irth was looking at the photographs, at the constructed thing in the deep dark, moving slowly and deliberately toward the council's interior space with the patience of something that had been planning this for longer than most council species had held spaceflight. How many? Irth said. 214 ships, Tors said. distributed across 6 staging points in non-council space, coordinated, fueled, ready. He paused one final time. We have been ready for 3 months. We were waiting for this meeting. The chamber absorbed that. 214 ships, built in the dark outside council space. Built by a species that had been expelled with 9 words of warning and a folded identification card, and had responded by building the most capable rapid response fleet in the Council's recorded history, in secret, without Council resources, without Council logistics, without anything except the particular human capacity to take an injustice, hold it very still, and convert it into something that the galaxy had never seen before. "Vote," said Ayerth, and her skin had shifted to a color Vel Shareth now recognized. It was the Thurian shade for gratitude mixed with relief mixed with a fear that was no longer quite as large as it had been an hour ago. The vote was 9-0. The battle for the Kareth threshold device lasted 11 days. Vel Shareth did not see most of it. He was on Threshold Station, managing the archive cascade, the simultaneous release of all the Kareth evidence to every non-compact species in the Council, coordinated with the emergency convening of a full Council session to address the Compact's conduct, which was its own 11-day war fought entirely in language and procedure, but no less brutal for that. He heard the reports. He processed them into the archive as they came in. He did not sleep well. On the 6th day, a Council communications relay picked up a fragment of a transmission from the Fleet UNES encoding, wartime protocol, brief enough to have gotten through the interference field that the construction vessels were apparently generating as a defensive measure. It was addressed to no one in particular. Vel Shareth suspected it had been sent to everyone. The text was 8 words, "Device not yet active. We are inside the perimeter." He looked at that message for a long time. We are inside the perimeter. The threshold device, based on the astronomical data, was surrounded by 6 construction vessels of unknown capability. Getting inside the perimeter meant getting through them, or around them, or past them by some method that no one at Threshold Station had been fully briefed on, because Tors had simply said we have a contact strategy and had not elaborated on the contact portion. The reports that came in over the next 5 days elaborated on it somewhat, in the way that aftermath reports always elaborate on things, retrospectively, incompletely, with the particular texture of accounts given by people who are still processing what they survived. The construction vessels had not been designed for combat, but they had not needed to be. They had been designed for construction, which meant they understood structural stress tolerances at a level of engineering precision that allowed them to use the threshold device's own emerging field as a defensive weapon, warping transit lanes, collapsing jump windows, creating spatial distortions that should have made coordinated fleet action in their vicinity effectively impossible. Should have. The UNES fleet did not coordinate in the way the construction vessels expected. 214 ships did not behave like a unified tactical unit. They behaved like Vel Shareth read the reports 3 times, and the description that kept appearing from multiple independent observers was weather. They behaved like weather. No 2 ships doing the same thing. No predictable vector. No pattern that the construction vessel's presumably sophisticated analysis could resolve into a threat model, because there was no pattern. There was only constant, overlapping, cascading individual action that collectively achieved things no coordinated fleet movement could have achieved, because no coordinated fleet doctrine had ever been designed to address 214 ships that were all making independent decisions simultaneously, and somehow, catastrophically. Making decisions that were mutually reinforcing. The construction vessels shut down on the 9th day. The threshold device stopped its activation sequence on the 11th. The reports did not fully explain why, because the pilots and commanders filing them were still trying to explain it to themselves. What Vel Shareth understood, reading between the lines of the technical language. The humans had done something to the device's activation architecture that required physical presence inside the construction field, which required someone to go inside the field during active operation, which was the kind of decision that rational tactical doctrine assessed as a non-survivable approach vector. The cost reports arrived on the 12th day. He read them in the archive room, in the same chair he'd sat in when the first human transponder faded from the tracking grid 2 years ago. He sat very still and read very carefully and processed what he read in the way archivists are trained to process things, accurately, completely, without editorial. 11 ships lost, 417 personnel, including Lieutenant Commander Adisa, who had been on the vessel that went inside the construction field to reach the device's core architecture, and who had, the report was precise about this, solved the problem. Vel Shareth sat with that for a long time. He thought about the photographs on the corridors, the places and children and coastlines, reasons. He thought about Commander Akafar, who had known for 11 months and said 9 words and folded her identification card, and had died 14 months ago getting the last piece of evidence, and who had a 200,000-ton warship named for her because the people who built it needed something to prove. He thought about Tors presenting evidence for 3 hours without notes, with that careful, precise economy of motion in a room he had no right to be in for a governing body that had expelled his species, asking for nothing except the authority to do the thing he had already built the capability to do. He thought about Ayerth's question, that is not a thing a rational political actor does. And Tor's answer, no, it isn't. He opened his archive file. He found the pending tag. He looked at the 3 questions he had been asking for 2 years. What had the humans found in the Karath exclusion zone? The edge of a conspiracy that had been running for 47 years, and the shape of something coming through the dark with patience that dwarfed anything the Council had ever encountered. Why had they said nothing at the expulsion hearing? Because the silence was the strategy. Because the expulsion was the resource. Because Akafar had looked at the situation and seen something no compact delegate had considered. That removing humans from Council space did not remove humans from the problem, and that humans, specifically and uniquely, would not stop working the problem simply because the authority structures around them had made working it inconvenient. What does it mean when the species expelled without a single counter-argument is also the species that contributed more than they consumed? It means they were not building towards something that benefited them in the transaction. They were building towards something that they alone, of all the species in the Council, had understood was coming and had decided quietly, without announcement, without anyone's permission to address. He closed the pending file. He labeled it Resolved. Then he opened a new file because this was his job and because the archive did not stop needing to be kept simply because the world had changed, and he began to write the official account of the Karath crisis and its resolution. He wrote for a long time. He was precise. He was complete. He was, as he had always been, accurate. When he reached the section on the UNES fleet, its size, its composition, its operations, its cost, he paused for the first time. He looked at the number. 417. He looked at the names below it, because the UNES had provided full casualty records, meticulously documented, with rank and age and place of origin and next of kin. The kind of documentation that no military in the Council's history had ever submitted alongside an after-action report, because no other military had treated it as essential data. Tors had said, "Someone needs to be awake every hour, because once you know it, you cannot unknow it, and the idea of being unconscious for 6 hours at a stretch stops feeling like rest and starts feeling like a gamble." They had known what was coming. They had known the cost was real and specific and personal. They had built 214 ships and trained 4,000 people and sustained a 2-year covert operation across non-Council space and come back to a governing body that had expelled them, and they had not demanded recognition or restitution or even an apology. They had demanded a single charter provision invoked, and then they had gone and done the work. 417 people who had been awake in shifts because the idea of sleeping felt like a gamble had placed that gamble and lost it, and had won something for a civilization of trillions who had not known to ask them to. Vel-Shareth wrote carefully. He wrote everything. He did not editorialize. He wrote the last line of the account. Then he sat back and read it. It said, "The Galactic Deliberative Council in emergency session voted 17-0 to formally reinstate Earth's membership at full status, effective immediately, with a formal apology for the conduct of the Karath expulsion procedure to be entered in the permanent record." He looked at the line for a long time. It was accurate. It was complete. It was everything that had happened. But it was not, he thought, the whole truth of what had happened. The whole truth was harder to file. The whole truth was in the photographs on the corridors, and the 3 colors of ink in the transcript margins, and the name on the bow of the Akafir's promise, and the buckled paper in drawer 47 of the council archive, where a stamp had been pressed too hard by someone who was performing, in the last moment available to her, the only form of record-keeping she had left. He added one more line. It was not standard archival language. He added it anyway, because he had been archive keeper for 35 years and had decided that today was the day he would permit himself one editorial observation in the official record. It said, "Note for future reference, appended by archive keeper Vel-Shareth. The Valorian Compact calculated that removing humanity from council space would neutralize the threat they represented. This assessment was incorrect. The Compact had observed humanity for 11 years and concluded they understood what motivated human action. This conclusion was also incorrect. Subsequent evidence suggests that humanity's defining characteristic is not strength, nor technology, nor political sophistication. It is the refusal to accept that a problem is finished simply because the problem has become expensive. Every rational civilization in the Council's history has, at some point, assessed a situation and concluded that the cost of continuing exceeded the expected value of the outcome. Humanity appears to lack the cognitive or emotional architecture to reach that conclusion. It is unclear whether this represents a limitation or an advantage. The evidence of the past 2 years suggests it may be both simultaneously, and that the distinction does not matter to them. He sealed the file. He looked at drawer 47 for a long moment. Then he went home. He did not sleep in shifts, but for a very long time, he did not sleep well either. Not because he was afraid, because he was thinking about the next problem. The one the threshold device's shutdown had not solved. The one Tors had mentioned once and then not mentioned again. Whatever is on the other side of the door, limited to whatever already came through to build it. The construction vessels had shut down. The device had gone silent. The immediate crisis was resolved. But the construction vessels had not come from nothing. They had come from somewhere. They had been built by something for a specific purpose, funded by a 47-year negotiation with the Valorian Compact. Whatever had funded that, whatever had sent those vessels, whatever had been patient enough to work on a 47-year timeline, it knew now that the door hadn't opened. It would be asking why. Vel-Shareth lay in the dark of his quarters on Threshold Station and looked at the ceiling and understood, finally and completely, why the humans had never stopped sleeping in shifts. Because the problem was not finished. It had only become more expensive. And somewhere in a ship named for a dead woman who had pressed a stamp too hard and said 9 words, and changed the galaxy, an admiral with careful hands and a contained smile was already at a table with star charts on the wall, working on what came next.